welcome to Todos Somos Marcos. Today we're going to be talking about the July 6th elections in Mexico, which were possibly a watershed event in modern Mexico history. Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas, the PRD candidate, won as mayor of Mexico City. Many people are saying he's now the second most important politician in Mexico. In Chiapas, the elections were very turbulent, and we're going to be talking or hearing from two people who were there as observers in Chiapas, Ty Brown and Lydia Brazon. So, thank you. Okay.
This is Lydia Brazon. I'm the Executive Director of the Humanitarian Law Project, and this is Ty Brown, who is on the board of the Humanitarian Law Project. And this was a Humanitarian Law Project delegation made up of 16 people, 11 of whom stayed in Mexico City, and 5 of us went to Chiapas. So we arrived in Mexico City on July the 2nd, and we were invited by Alianza Cívica that has been much maligned by the government, and there was a great deal of controversy as to their ability to receive funds from Europe in order to continue with their election observation work that they've done so wonderfully in the past few years. So we were invited by Alianza Cívica, and we arrived there, and we did participate in a number of meetings. We did have an advance team there. The one thing that we always make an effort to do is to be very, very serious about our observation. That means we try to be as prepared as we possibly can.
I'm talking about Mexico City, not because I was there, like she said, but I have all the reports. Unfortunately, none of our Mexico City observers is here at the moment. I will start with, well, I have to say, the good news first is the PRI lost, and that's good news not because we're partisan, of course, but because there was obviously the ability for the PRI to lose. As you probably know, the Mexico City mayoralship was not an elected position up until this term, this year, and it's actually very powerful. It's 20 million people, but it's also a very visible situation, so the new mayor, Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas, will have power over Mexico City, but he's also got a lot of visibility to launch symbolic sorts of resistance to the seemingly crumbling PRI regime, although we'll talk about how on a regional level that's less true than it is on a national level, which is important to realize. So you read in the newspaper, Cuauhtémoc won, everything was wonderful, and that's actually not true. There was actually a lot of fraud in Mexico City, at least in the areas where just about all our observers were. But because there were so many observers, and because there was so much press there, and also the national observers, it wasn't enough to derail things. But the PRI was up to its old, mostly the PRI. I think I actually did get at least one report of some party reps that were not PRI doing something, but by and large it was PRI representatives and non-official PRI folks, kind of party bosses in the areas that were doing some things. So let me tell you about some of the things we saw, and if you know anything about Mexican elections, these should sound fairly familiar. The most dramatic thing that happened was 2 of our observers were trying, as was their right, to get in to observe the vote count at the end of the day in one of the casillas in Mexico City. I think Lydia mentioned we actually chose some of the more conflicted, intense regions of Mexico City and the outlying area to observe. We had a right as international, we weren't called observers, we were called visitors, because technically they're not allowed to have foreigners involved in the election process. But we did have the right to observe the vote count. And Evangeline Ordaz, that's not her, but so we're talking about the most dramatic incident. We saw 2 of our observers trying to get in and observe the vote count, which was their right, and a couple of pre-representatives would not let them in. There was an argument. They were threatened. As a matter of fact, it got very tense, and they did the right thing. They decided to leave the area, and they were followed by 2 of these, I think actually followed by 3 people, an unidentified person and 2 people they identified as PRI. I don't know if they were officials, but were somehow associated with the PRI. They got in their car, and although they did not see who did it, within about a block of that place where they were trying to observe the vote count, someone threw a rock through their back windshield, shattered the back windshield, and it actually missed the 2 of them. Luckily, it landed right between them. But that gives you an idea of the level of seriousness because that was Mexico City where all the press was, and that sort of thing was going on. Let me continue their story because it's really quite interesting. They decided to file a complaint with the Federal Electoral Institute, which you would think would be the right thing to do. That's what the IFE, which is the acronym, that's what they're there for. They're supposed to be independent, and they're supposed to take advantage of take care of all kinds of problems, and if things get too bad, they have the power to even annul elections or, I imagine, levy fines or that sort of thing. They went to the IFE to make this complaint. A couple of people threatened us, and probably the same people threw a rock at us. You know, seems like a legitimate complaint. The IFE seemed to have no process for them to file the complaint. They first didn't even know who to send them to, and then they gave them the runaround a little while, and finally they gave them a couple blank sheets of paper and say write down what happened, but they had no process, and nor do they even seem really interested in taking their report and doing anything about it. Now since then, since we sort of went public with this story, and especially since one of our observers was actually a congressional chief of staff, they have told us, or we have been told, that they're going to launch a major investigation into this incident, but I doubt it, to be honest. Here's some of the other things. First, to set the stage, you are probably aware, you may have talked about on your show, that the police in Mexico City several months ago were all pulled out for military-style training, and the military was actually put in their place. Then so many of these police failed the military training that the military is seemingly on a sort of permanent basis, or I'd say a semi-permanent basis in Mexico City. The impact of this right before elections should be fairly clear, and the role of the military was particularly clear in Chiapas, because everywhere we went, Lydia will tell you about, there was lots of military around us, very intimidating. But it's our view that it was also a very intimidating presence in Mexico City to have all these. They didn't wear military uniforms, but everybody knew who they were, and that was kind of an intimidating situation. Some of the other stuff we saw, old-fashioned tricks. In the category of coercion, Lynn Halpin did a nice several-page summary of the area where they observed and how it was a lot of public housing projects and how people were very pressured in order to get the public services that they were actually entitled to vote for the PRI, that sort of thing. We got several reports of. Some of the things that some of our observers noted in passing, but I actually marked as being more significant maybe than they even noticed. There was one casilla where people could not vote because they ran out of ballots, which is strange in itself, although the special casillas in 94, they are special casillas where people who, for some reason or another, can't be at their home voting place, they can go to these special casillas. In 1994, they ran out of ballots because they had such a small number, and it was also a problem because so many people were shaved off the voting list that they couldn't vote at their normal site. They went to the special casilla, and they ran out of ballots, so they were essentially not able to vote. They increased the number of ballots at these special casillas to 750, and as far as we know, they didn't run out too often, although it did happen. But we did hear about, at least in one casilla, people were coming to vote, they were out of ballots, but they wanted to get their voter credentials stamped anyway because their employer told them that they had to vote. So they had to get their, I don't know if you noticed this, they had to they were trying to say, can we get this stamped even though we didn't vote, because our employer, he says we have to do that. That's very indicative of some pressure. I mean, there's no way for the employer to know for sure who they're voting for, but it does indicate that there's some pressure coming from the owners of whatever company it is, who are most likely linked to the PRI. We also, two of our observers arrived at a casilla just after somebody was arrested. We don't know if charges were pressed, and unfortunately we did not have the resources to do the kind of follow-through we would like.
We also didn't have the visa. They gave us a shorter visa this time than last time. That means that by the 13th we had to be out of there. The bulk of the really dramatic electoral abuses are usually made known after the fact. And we saw that as a negative indication toward international observers, because last time at least we were given till the end of the month, and this time we had to be out of there by the 13th.
Yeah, and that's one reason we couldn't do the kind of follow-up we'd like, but they witnessed an arrest, and they found out that it was someone associated with the PRI, and I had actually wondered, how can you make somebody vote when it's secret sometimes? I'll tell you how it's not secret other times. That's another problem, but how the ballot is secret, how can you make somebody vote for your party? And here's one way it works. This guy was arrested for this, He'd done, he was paying voters 100 pesos. What he would do is give them a pre-marked ballot. They were to put that in their pocket, go vote, get a blank ballot, turn in the pre-marked ballot, and then they would turn in the blank ballot to the person who was paying out the money, and that would ensure that he knew that the pre-marked ballot had been given and used as the vote, so he knew who they voted for. Actually very clever as far as fraud goes. We heard several reports of it, and in one casilla where they showed up, although our observers didn't witness it, they were told by some of the party representatives there that that had happened. Secrecy of the vote I should talk about. We saw this in Chiapas, but also in Mexico City. A lot of places where the casillas are jammed together, where pre-officials are, quote, helping, unquote, people vote. At least one incident where someone went into the voting booth with a woman, put her arm around the woman's shoulder and actually marked the ballot for the woman. And since it's just an X, it's not really that difficult to mark. So then went out, got her own ballot, and voted herself. Incidents where people actually displayed their ballots to the people at the official table there, the people who ran that particular electoral booth. This sort of thing happened. We saw some incidents of shaving of the voter list, people who were not on the list. That happened in Mexico City. And that gets to be kind of a problem. It feeds into this idea of the crazy rat, which is a name for the kind of fraud where someone can't vote at their casilla, they're sent to another one, they're sent to another one, they're sent to another one in hopes of discouraging them. I cannot say that we saw, that our observers saw a lot of incidents of that, but at least at one special casilla where they were there for a few minutes, 8 people showed up who were not able to vote at their casilla in Mexico City. So it did happen. We don't know how much. Just to stop the Mexico City part and to transition to the Chiapas part where there were so many problems. The one big problem with what happened in Mexico City is it got such good press coverage that I think the world opinion now is that elections in Mexico are clean. Mm-hmm. And that's really dangerous because, as you'll hear in Chiapas, we're pretty sure that our physical presence actually prevented some more major incidents from happening, and they were happening sort of all around us. And previous to the elections, a lot of violence, a lot of intimidation. And without national and international observers, which is what I'm worried about, is Mexico City, opposition won, so we don't have to worry about needing national observers, and there was already discussion of that, especially international observers. There was already discussion of getting rid of that now that this has happened, and that to me seems really, really dangerous. So we want to emphasize that what happened in Mexico City was definitely a step in the right direction, but was no reason to back off of needing the national and international observation. And with that, we'll go to Chiapas.
Okay, and I'll start Chiapas with, again, as I said, we arrived in Mexico City on July the 2nd. That same day, Subcomandante Insurgente Marcos put out a communique explaining the reasons for the communities in rebellion not to participate in the elections. It was a decision that was certainly pending. It was not a great shock to anyone. The indigenous communities had basically taken that position since January of this year. But everybody was on pins and needles as to what the Zapatista reaction was going to be to the elections and what was going to be the ultimate decision on their part in relation to the elections. The upshot of what they put out was, you can vote, but we're not going to. The conditions simply are not there. The rationale for it was obviously they don't even have the conditions to go out and plant their crops or to have any kind of normal lifestyle whatsoever. How can anyone expect them to go out on election day and cast a vote as if it were a normal day in the suburbs type of thing? I mean, it just is totally out of any kind of realistic context. So that was very well received, including even by the opposition. Everyone understood that position. That was not to be questioned at that moment. It was understandable. By this time, the CONAI of the diocese and the various entities involved with the peace talks had all put out reports saying the conditions simply were not there in the areas of conflict. Now, the areas of conflict is where you have a departure of definition, meaning that the area of conflict is not just the Selva Lacandon, where Subcomandante Marcos and the Zapatistas have defined territories and autonomous regions. The area of conflict also includes the northern region of Chiapas, which is where we were observing, where the death squads and the paramilitary groups run rampant with total impunity attacking Zapatista supporters and Zapatistas and PRD people in those regions. So in fact, among the things that had happened is that just days before the election, of course, there was the attack in Sabanilla, which is adjacent to one of the areas that we were observing in, which is in Tila. They killed 2 children, a 15-year-old and an 11-year-old, in the group of 8 people that they murdered. We came face to face with these bands of people that they had murdered, but I'll get into that later. But anyway, so that was the environment into which we went. When we traveled down there, the input we got is that Alianza Cívica had been trying like crazy to get people to go, observers to go into the region that we were going. They couldn't get anybody that would venture going into that area. It's a very, very dangerous area normally to go to. This is the same area where many human rights workers and so forth have been shot at and attacked and so forth. But we had made an informed decision to do so far in advance of this particular day and time. So the big question was, so that was on Wednesday. We arrived on Friday, and on Saturday we set out to go look at a military base. Since we were there in April when we had taken a delegation to Chiapas, they have set up a number of new military bases, and so that was going to be our task on Saturday. Unbeknownst to us, on Friday, there had been an article actually put out by AP, by what I'm told, well, anyway, a government slanted article by AP, putting out the line that the communities, for example, in Ocosingo, where we were also going to be observing, were not going to pay attention to Marcos. And that that the communities were very divided on whether to heed Marcos's call not to vote. And this was not true. And it was obviously designed to cause schisms and disinformation. So on Saturday, and I have not actually seen the report, I was told this by other reporters, that then the communities, the indigenous communities, put out a communique of their own, signed a communique from the communities in rebellion, saying, okay, we told you we were not going to vote, but if this is the game you want to play, now you're not going to vote. And so there's no way to determine whether the now infamous burning of the casillas on election day were the Zapatistas, but I mean, certainly they were told that it would be. And these are the indigenous communities, okay? So that's to put it within the context. If it was the Zapatistas, then that was the rationale for it. And I'm just saying if, because we don't know, even though we were close by. But that was the environment that we went into on election day. From my perspective, and particularly in retrospect, it was a very eerie day on election day. It was kind of like a ghost town, those in the old Western movies where you just see the tumbleweed, going, and you know that the bad guys and the good guys are going to face off, and there's like everybody clears and runs for cover. That's how it was. You could hear a pin drop in these communities. It was totally chilling. There was one of our observers at the casilla where he was, it was one vote cast after an hour and a half. And these lists were all comprised of more than 500 voters per list, per casilla, one vote. So what happened was, of course, that the abstention, which was more than 80%, some of the estimates are 86% of voter abstention. It was so substantive, so united, and so concrete that it is indisputable that it was a conscious effort on their part to have a voice and to cast their vote, which is how we're positioning it. That was their vote. The abstention was definitely their vote. And even in Ocosingo, where the candidate was a candidate for the PRD, but he wasn't a PRD person, by party normally. He was voted on by the indigenous. These are not Zapatistas, but these are indigenous community who respected the stand of the Zapatistas enough to refrain from voting, even though this was their candidate who would have won had they all come out to vote, because the larger issue was more important, because what they're experiencing in their communities is so extreme.
Around another guy was there, big kind of menacing looking fellow. who was definitely following us around, and he was taking our photograph. And he was very clever the way he did it. He stepped back and he looked like he was taking a photograph of the casilla, and I was watching him the whole time, sort of out of the corner of my eye. He would turn the camera this way while he was looking straight forward and take a picture. And then he dropped the camera down and his eyes were looking straight forward. He was never looking right at us, you know. So I just took his picture directly. And I'd show you that picture had there been film.
Okay.
Anyway, but so this guy that is a very, very serious breach, and it was actually the thing that the officials that we talked to, the PRD representatives, for example, were most concerned about. Alianza Civica was most concerned about this fella taking pictures. I didn't mention, but in Mexico City there was at least one place where people were filming the voters, and that can be a very intimidating thing to have your face there on film. So he followed us around, and then I don't even know how to explain the next bit of this. I'll just do it very briefly, but just suffice it to say, it was a very confusing, I don't know if it was subterfuge or just designed to confuse us or what. A guy came up, said he was with the Cardenista party, a little party, which I think actually has some pre-affiliations. Said he was an openly gay candidate in Ocosingo, so he had won our sympathy. We figured he was definitely an outsider and really needed some assistance. And he was giving us all this information about casillas that hadn't opened and how they were going to annul the elections, a lot of which actually turned out to be true. Then he started giving some very strange analysis that the PRD somehow or another runs the military, and we started to understand that there was something a little odd about this fellow. And he said he was in an alliance with the PRI and the PAN in Ocosingo for fair and free elections. And that also seemed a little odd to us because he said the PRD would not join this alliance. Then he tried to offer us voter lists to photocopy, which would be a direct violation of the law, so we don't know if he was actually trying to entrap us. It's what it seemed like to us. So we spent a lot of time dealing with this guy before we realized that there was something bogus about what was going on. And he knew who the PRI guy was who was taking our picture. He's the one who identified him as a PRI operative of some sort. Then he brought over to us an IFE official, or at least someone who said he was an IFE official, who said he was very upset about this guy photographing it. Why don't you point him out to us? Point him out to us. And Lydia pointed out to the IFE official that the gentleman, the Cardenista, who had been talking to us before, knew very well who the PRI guy was, so just ask this Cardenista guy who it is and go talk to him yourself. We don't need to point him out, you know who he is. This was the sort of thing that was going on the whole time. And like I said, left Ocosingo proper after that, so we don't really know what happened with those folks, but we did see them all, actually everybody that night after the voting was over. And one thing in Ocosingo that was, to me, the most telling was, all day long in the square, nobody was there. It's a public square. Voters weren't there, but really very few people were there at all. After the voting time was over, it was full of people. It was amazing. There's vendors and people, and it was like a big party. And but who was there but our military guy, the Cardenista party guy, another guy I'd seen associating with the military guy who'd been in, all the people that had been following us around early in the morning were all eating at the hotel there with us, and it was really quite interesting. But that's
so one of the other interesting, but anyway, so that was later in the evening. We did see some evidence of what we didn't realize that at the time was the beginning of a roadblock. So there were we called it our twig, but by the time minutes after we had passed, there was an actual roadblock, and there were a number of roadblocks. Also, the Zapatistas were held responsible for that to some degree, and this is just kind of inclusion, is that certainly coming out of the elections as a whole, the PRD, in particular Cuauhtemoc, and that's not always synonymous with the PRD in terms of his support, has a great, an overwhelming mandate here. They have a great deal of support. This was throughout the whole country, even where they lost, but the PRI, and everybody knows they did win in those areas, in Campeche and whatever. So they know they go that the PRD goes into this with a great deal of mandate. So do the Zapatistas, because the Zapatistas were able to pull off this incredible vote abstention, and cohesively, consciously, they announced it. It was done. They were not rebuffed by even non-Zapatista community leaders, etc. And so they go into it stronger. They come out of these elections stronger, in my opinion, in terms of the negotiations, than they went into it.